And this discussion is about children, especially young children's experience in childcare and how that can impact their later adjustment. Most young children in the US today receive some sort of regular non-maternal care between the ages of 0 and 6. It's about 61%. Um, Infants and toddlers are most likely to spend their time in home-based care arrangements, although some will spend time in more of a center base. Preschoolers are more likely to spend time in center-based care arrangements like preschools or daycares, but some of them will still spend time in more informal care like childcare homes. Um, the type of care is not as an important predictor of the outcomes that children might experience, but a lot of parents seem to prefer the more home-like atmosphere for the younger infants and toddlers and the more school-like atmosphere of a center for their older preschoolers. The most important predictor, though, of children's outcomes is really their relationships within their family. So when we talk about different types of childcare in the U.S., we have a patchwork, and many children experience more than one type of care, either over time or even at the same time. So childcare can be center based. And the words we use there that you may hear are preschool, daycare, and historically there was this sort of distinction between what were considered preschools and what were considered daycares. The daycares were more um, of a place where we can keep children safe while parents are working, and so it was designed to accommodate the needs and hours of working families. What were called preschools or sometimes nursery schools were seen as more of an enrichment program. They weren't necessarily based on working hours; they might only be half a day, but they were for families that wanted enrichment or social interaction opportunities for their preschool children. Today, we've seen more of a blurring between those traditional kinds of categories as daycares are more and more added uh, meaningful curriculum and enrichment opportunities, and what would have been considered preschools have had to adapt to the changes in society where most folks can't utilize a half day childcare anymore as parents are busy and working, and so the two have come closer and closer to being uh, the same. And so we're more often just to use a word like center based childcare today to talk about all those different kinds of groups. When they're in a child's home, that could be a babysitter or a nanny. When they're in the provider's home, that could be a licensed childcare home, or it could be an unlicensed, more informal kind of arrangement. It could be a family friend or neighbor or kith and kin, a person in the neighborhood who takes care of a group of children in the neighborhood. Some other variations include the amount, how much time does a child spend in those different childcare arrangements. But what seems to be the most important variation is the quality. And in the United States today, we have an amazing range of quality from shockingly and frighteningly low quality to really, really good quality care. And for the most part, it's a matter of quality care is expensive. Now, that doesn't mean that it's only accessed by rich people. Some of the highest quality programs are programs like Head Start, which are subsidized and available for children with uh, varying degrees of risk factors in their lives and who live in poverty. But for the most part, uh, parents in the U.S. Get the best that they can that for the child care. The number one reason that parents choose a particular kind of child care is based on the cost of that child care, which is just the reality. If you can't afford it, you can't afford it. The number two reason is based on the location and convenience of the child care. So, and that makes sense too. It doesn't matter if it's the best quality. If it's 30 miles away and you can't get to work on time, that's not gonna work out for your family. So only after those very pragmatic and realistic kinds of factors do parents really take into the account of quality. And parents, on by and large, aren't really necessarily great at being able to perceive the quality of the program. They may not know what factors to really look for. High quality childcare involves caregivers who are sensitive, they're warm, it's a language rich environment, so they're using a lot of language. They're teaching things like emergent literacy and informal math in developmentally appropriate ways. And the caregivers are stable. And that stability is a real issue because so many uh, positions in early childhood education and in early child care are so low paying. There tends to be a lot of turnover, which can impact the quality of the program because you don't have that stability of the relationship there. Um, some other aspects of quality of a program is that early childhood teachers and care providers, one indicator of quality is their general knowledge of child development, and another is their experience working with children. And these two things overlap, but they're not the same. So some folks have a lot of education in a formal setting, like a college class, and what children are like, but maybe not that experience. Whereas there's some others who may not have had that formal knowledge, but who have the experience. There, another factor that's associated with childcare quality is a group of things that are called regulable. And that means that you can make rules or regulations about these. And these include things like the size of the group, how many children of a given age are allowed to be in a group. Related to that, but separate, is the child to adult ratio. So, how many adults are there for every child in the group? Uh, and then other things that are regulable include just the size of the space, how many bathrooms are there per child, all those kinds of things, safety on the playground that we can regulate through law. Those more dispositional aspects of the care providers, we can't really regulate. Those things like warmth, responsiveness, uh, the quality of their interactions with children. So back in the 19 there were studies of childcare and the impact of children have gone back quite a while, but by the 1990s, there was some disagreement in the literature, in the research body. There was a group of researchers and theorists who were concerned that non-maternal care could have a negative impact on children. These were largely researchers and theorists who were working from an attachment perspective and who were concerned that non maternal care might break down that attachment relationship and have a negative impact on kids. There was also a large body of research and work that showed positive impact of childcare or early childhood education experiences on young children. Going back to the 1970s, the federal government had put in place Head Start, which, as I said, provided quality care for children in poverty and children with other risk factors. And there was a body of research showing the benefits that these kind of programs were having for children as they transitioned to school later. And so there was this debate going on. And in the 1990s, the National Institute of Child and Human Development, NICHD, put in place a large national longitudinal study to sort of address those questions. So, at a variety of different locations throughout the country, they took some researchers who were from that more of an attachment camp and some who were more from that early childhood education camp and said, "You guys figure this out, work together." And they followed children from birth through their preschool years up through their time into school, and they could sort of look at that long-term impact of their early childhood experience. And the following slides are going to have some results from that study along with other studies. So I'm just kind of distilling down the bigger picture here and what we know about the impact of childcare. And first is research that's focused on children's language and their cognitive ability when they get to school. And the story here is that higher quality care is linked to better cognitive and language ability when children get to elementary school than lower quality care is. That effect is especially strong for children who are living in poverty. So, children who are living in poverty, who are in high quality early child care programs, are showing up to elementary school doing better for language and cognitive. Well, children in all SES are, but especially children in low SES homes. This is sometimes described as through the words of compensatory hypothesis, meaning that children who may not have as much access to other enriching opportunities are especially benefited by the enrichment provided in a high quality childcare. There are some findings about type. After age 3, center based care is linked to better abilities than home based care. Uh, After school care among school age children, higher quality is linked to better abilities in language and cognitive, and that effect is also stronger for the children who are living in the lowest SES homes. In terms of attachment, that the quality of attachment to from the infant to their mother, the quality of attachment is associated there. So when children are experiencing lower quality out of home care or lower quality non maternal care or unstable care, they are more likely to have a more insecure attachment with their mother. And this is especially true when the mothers themselves are less sensitive to the infant. There's a linkage also with the amount. More than 10 hours a week of non-maternal care is linked to a greater risk for insecure attachment. That doesn't mean that all the children will experience that. It means there's a correlation there, and that's especially true again for the less sensitive mothers. There's no impact of the type of care, assuming that the quality of care is the same. Uh, and home care may have a higher quality for infants in terms of child attachment. So, the research on children's social competence, their ability to interact with peers, to behave in socially appropriate ways, children who experience low quality care, that's linked to long term behavior problems, long term acting out, aggression with peers, and those sorts of things. Higher quality is linked to better social skills long term, uh, uh, but there's a little bit of a trick there. Regardless of the quality of care, children who spend more time in childcare are reported by their kindergarten and first grade teachers as being a little more aggressive and a little more defiant with adults. It's not a level that would reach a clinical kind of level. You couldn't go into a classroom and say, oh, this child is aggressive. They must have been in childcare. But over that large group of kids in the NICHD study, that is a trend that does emerge. Center-based care particularly is linked to those behavior problems. Uh, and children who are in self-care, especially elementary school age children who are cared for at their latchkey kids at home by themselves or with their sibling, that's linked to higher rates of antisocial behavior if there's a high amount of that self-care. So levels greater than 10 hours a week. High quality care is associated with young children having a higher quality of play, and center-based care is associated with more complex peer play among preschoolers than time and home-based care is. And finally, I want to make a transition statement here and and talk a little bit, just a moment, about resilience, because so many of those kinds of research, for example, the impact of childcare, is it's looking at what are the negative effects, what are the risk factors. And so often when we're talking about research about child development, we're talking about what is correlated with children having difficulty later. So, for example, low quality care is associated with children having difficulty later. And we've identified a whole slew of different risk factors, really. Being a child who's born with a low birth weight is a risk factor. Being born in poverty is a very huge risk factor. Uh, Having low quality care, living in a neighborhood where the census tract from the zip code has higher crime rates, that's a risk factor. Uh, so when we talk about risk factors, what any of those kinds of things, what we're doing is we're saying that there's a correlation between having this risk factor and having some adjustment difficulty later. But you'll remember that correlation doesn't mean causation. And that means we could never go to any given child and say, oh, you were in low quality childcare, or oh, you lived in poverty, or you were low birth weight, or you had a parent who was substance abuse, or any of those risk factors, and say you're going to have this negative outcome. It just doesn't work that way, because statistics are based on a whole population and not making that prediction about any individual. And in fact, if you take the next step in that thought and think about it, there are individuals that we know who have had a lot of those risk factors as they were growing up. They maybe did go to that unstable childcare or low quality care. Maybe they did have, uh, maybe they were low birth weight. Maybe they did live in poverty, and yet they've turned out fine or even great, and they've done great things. Um, and this is when we start to think about, instead of looking for risk factors that put children at risk, and there's a value to that in terms of identifying things that we know can be have a negative impact of children. But instead of framing our minds that way, we think of, what is it about some children that was protective? What buffered them? Why was this child, despite all these challenges, why have they been so successful? And there we're starting to talk about resilience, those protective factors. And when we talk about resilience, a lot of times we're talking about internal factors, things about a given child that helps them to overcome adversity and stress and difficulties. Starting back in the 1960s, there was a large longitudinal study in the island of Kauai in Hawaii, where it's a really amazing study to me, because it was an island. They could follow every single child that was born that year going forward. And so if you took that island, you had some children who were born with a lot of benefits in life. They were born very rich. And you have some children who were born with a lot of challenges in life. You had children who were they were children of immigrants, or of uh, workers on sugarcane plantations, or parents who were incarcerated, or who were substance abusers, or who lived in really terrible poverty. So you had this full range right there in this little on this island of different SES levels and different life experiences. And as they identified those risk factors as children grow older, there were some kids who did have those negative kind of impacts, who did have those adjustment difficulties. But there were some children who, uh, despite the risk factors in their life, despite those challenges, they they were very successful and turned out really well, or very stable, or they had positive families, life themselves when they grew up. And these resilient children, when they went back and looked at, try to identify things that they had in common, there was one thing that all these resilient children had, that they shared in common, and that was that every one of them had an adult that just loved the daylights out of them, that they could depend on over time. That they had, it could have been a coach, or it could have been an auntie, or it could have been a clergy person, a preacher, or it could have been a teacher. They had someone that they could depend on. And that was one of the keys for their resilience. So some of the things that we know are associated with resilience in children include a warm and secure relationship with their parents, supportive teachers, a strong view of themselves and a self concept, and high quality peer friendships. So this idea of having that person that provides stability and support is a really powerful and important one as we think about how children can develop over time. I'm having trouble with my Zoom.